band of unconfirmed rescues.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
They told you Gaddafi was a tyrant. They told you he was a monster who had to be removed for the sake of human rights. But what if I told you that Gaddafi was not destroyed for what he did wrong, but for what he did right? What if the real threat was not his brutality, but his independence? For years, the West showed you images of rebels fighting for freedom. They never showed you the other side, the country with Africa's highest standard of living. The free healthcare, the free electricity, the literacy rate rising from 25% to 87%, the first African satellite he funded, the dream of a gold-backed African currency that terrified Paris. Because the truth is simple, Gaddafi was building a version of Africa that did not need permission. And that vision had to be stopped. His final moments were streamed to the world. But the real story was buried in silence. A silence shared not only by Western capitals, but by African leaders who looked away. If this is the part they never wanted you to hear, leave a like so more people can see it. In 2011, NATO launched its air campaign with a single justification: protect civilians. But the leaked emails told a different story. France wanted 35% of Libya's oil. The United States wanted influence. Britain and Italy wanted contracts. And the rebels, armed and trained from the outside, were already negotiating resources before they even held power. The African Union proposed a ceasefire. Gaddafi accepted. NATO rejected it. 3 African nations on the United Nations Security Council voted yes to the resolution that opened the sky for bombs. The stage was set, the script was written, and Libya was erased from within and without. And the consequences did not stop at its borders. Before the bombs fell and before the headlines shouted the word dictator, Libya was an anomaly in Africa. It was the exception that proved a larger truth: when an African nation controls its own resources, its destiny changes. Libya under Gaddafi was not perfect, but it was functional, stable, and prosperous in ways that threatened an entire geopolitical order. This is the part that the cameras never showed. This is the context deliberately removed from the narrative, because once you understand the country Gaddafi built, you begin to understand why so many powerful actors wanted it gone. For more than 4 decades, Libya used its oil wealth not to enrich foreign corporations, but to build a social state that was unmatched on the continent. Healthcare was free. Education was free. Electricity was free. Newlyweds received $40,000 to $50,000 to start their families. Homelessness was essentially non-existent. University students studied abroad on government scholarships. Loans for homes carried 0 interest. Libya had no external debt. And as the years passed, Gaddafi shifted his focus from Libya to Africa as a whole, pushing for a continent that would one day break free from foreign currencies, foreign militaries, and foreign narratives. And this is where the story becomes bigger than Libya. Because Gaddafi was not simply running a country, he was challenging a system. Take the African Satellite Project. Before 2007, every African phone call, every television broadcast, and every internet connection had to pass through European satellites. That meant Africa was paying up to $500 million a year in fees to Europe just to talk to itself. Gaddafi changed that with one signing. He funded the first African satellite, cutting communication costs by more than 80% and breaking a dependency that had lasted generations. France, which controlled much of that satellite revenue, was not pleased. But this was only the beginning. Gaddafi wanted a unified African passport, a single continental army, and a banking system independent from Western oversight. And then came the idea that set off alarms in Paris: a gold-backed African currency, the gold dinar. If launched successfully, it would undermine the CFA franc, the currency France uses to control 14 African countries. Under the CFA system, those nations must deposit half of their foreign reserves into the French treasury. Not as cooperation. As obligation. As tribute. It is one of the most profitable post-colonial arrangements in the world. A gold-backed African currency threatened to collapse that system overnight. It threatened French banks. It threatened French political influence. It threatened billions of dollars in revenue. Most importantly, it threatened the psychological dependency that kept Africa tied to Europe for more than half a century. And Gaddafi was not whispering this idea in a closed room. He was campaigning for it publicly. He was lobbying African leaders. He was financing AU projects. He was building the infrastructure for a financially sovereign Africa. You do not target a man like that with debate. You target him with warfare. But the Western powers were not acting alone. That is another truth often buried in the sand. Many African leaders who shook Gaddafi's hand in public feared him in private. They feared his influence. They feared losing French or American support. They feared sanctions. And in some cases, they feared becoming the next target. Dependency makes cowards out of nations. And Africa in 2011 was a continent full of governments that depended on external approval to survive. At the United Nations, 3 African votes, South Africa, Nigeria, and Gabon, became the turning point. Their approval gave NATO the legal cover it needed to launch a humanitarian intervention. The African Union protested. It proposed a ceasefire. It planned a delegation to negotiate peace. Gaddafi accepted the proposal. NATO ignored it. The rebels rejected it. And the African leaders who voted yes stayed silent as the bombs fell. This was not just a failure of courage. It was an alignment of interests. Libya's downfall opened opportunities. Western countries promised post-war contracts. Oil deals were drafted before Tripoli even collapsed. Political elites saw an opportunity to remove a man who questioned their legitimacy and overshadowed them at every African summit. France promised economic incentives. The United States offered diplomatic rewards. Silence had a price, and many were willing to accept it. Gaddafi became the target not because he oppressed his people, but because he empowered them. Because he challenged monetary colonialism. Because he funded African autonomy. Because he refused to outsource Libya's wealth to foreigners. And because he believed Africa should stand together. Not kneel separately. If you think this pattern sounds familiar, if you think this is not coincidence but design, tell me in the comments. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes, the narrative that brought down Libya was constructed, polished, and exported. Western media portrayed Gaddafi as irrational, unpredictable, dangerous. They never showed the millions of Africans who benefited from his investments. They never showed the AU buildings he financed, the regional banks he proposed, the military coalitions he supported, the development funds he established. And when Libyans themselves tried to contradict the narrative, their voices were overshadowed by the machinery of international storytelling. The truth is that Gaddafi did not fall in 2011. He was pushed. And the push came from every direction, from Western capitals that feared his independence. From multinational corporations that wanted access to Libya's oil, from African leaders who traded loyalty for convenience, and from a global order that could not tolerate a wealthy, sovereign, defiant African nation rewriting the rules. Libya's tragedy did not begin with civil war. It began with a decision, the decision that Africa was not allowed to succeed on its own terms. To understand why Libya was dismantled with such speed and precision, you have to look beyond the battlefield and into the boardrooms, the intelligence cables, and the diplomatic corridors where the real decisions were made. Libya was not just a target. It was a prize. And the forces that converged on it form a network of interests that stretches from Paris to Washington, from Doha to London, and from the African continent to the oil markets of the world. At the center of that network was France. No country lobbied harder for the removal of Gaddafi than France, and no leader was more personally invested than President Nicolas Sarkozy. His political career, his financial scandals, and his geopolitical ambitions were all intertwined with Libya. The leaked emails made one thing painfully clear: France had 5 objectives. Secure Libyan oil for French corporations. Expand French influence in North Africa. Strengthen domestic political standing ahead of elections. Block Gaddafi's plan for a gold-backed currency. Prevent Libya from becoming Africa's financial engine. In other words, this was never about human rights. It was about money, influence, and control. French intelligence had watched Gaddafi's activities for years, his funding of the African Union, his support for liberation movements, his calls for a single African army, his push for a Central African Bank, and most dangerously, his growing popularity across the continent. A man like that does not simply threaten France's interests. He threatens France's identity as a post-colonial power. But France did not act alone. The United States had its own reasons. After the Iraq War, Washington needed a successful intervention to repair its image. Libya became the easy candidate. It was oil-rich, politically isolated, and conveniently misrepresented. The State Department saw Libya as a chance to reshape North Africa, cement NATO's role, secure energy flows to Europe, and send a message to other nations considering economic independence. The leaked emails to Hillary Clinton revealed discussions about Libya's gold reserves, about the strategic value of destabilizing Gaddafi, and about the opportunity to reshape the region's political map. When the narrative of protecting civilians was public, the real conversation was about resources and geopolitics. Meanwhile, Britain and Italy were motivated by competition. Italy relied heavily on Libyan oil and gas. Britain wanted a bigger stake in the region. Both had tense histories with Gaddafi. Both saw an opportunity to renegotiate contracts once a new government was installed. The rebels were the leverage. Rookie militias with foreign sponsors are not liberators. They are instruments. Qatar flooded them with money. The United Arab Emirates armed them. Intelligence services arranged training, logistics, and coordination. People often forget this part. Libya was not a revolution. It was an externally engineered regime change where the rebels were a facade for an international coalition operating from the shadows. Then there was the role of African leaders. Some were complicit. Some were afraid. Some were opportunistic. But almost none stood up. South Africa, Nigeria, and Gabon provided the votes that allowed NATO to unleash its military machine. Why? Because each had something to gain, or something to protect. Nigeria sought Western backing against internal insurgencies. South Africa wanted diplomatic concessions. Gabon depended heavily on French political and economic support. When dependency shapes policy, betrayal becomes easy. But the network extended even further. European banks saw Libya's sovereign wealth fund as a threat. That fund had billions ready to invest in African infrastructure, African energy, and African independence. Western corporations feared losing access to Libya's oil and gas fields. Weapons manufacturers saw an opportunity in a prolonged conflict. Even regional players like Qatar saw a chance to export their political agenda and expand influence in North Africa. Every layer of the network had its own reason for wanting Gaddafi gone. And every layer played its part. Western media produced the narrative. Diplomats produced the resolutions. Military alliances produced the bombs. Neighboring states produced the funding and weapons for the rebels. African leaders produced the silence. Together, it formed an architecture of intervention that looked less like liberation and more like a coordinated extraction operation. And once the system set its sights on Libya, there was no realistic pathway for Gaddafi to survive politically. The African Union's peace plan was ignored. Negotiations were shut down. Ceasefire proposals were rejected. International observers were kept out. Humanitarian corridors were manipulated. The outcome had been predetermined long before the first protest began. The most revealing part of the story is this: many of the agreements made with the rebels, oil contracts, diplomatic promises, access pledges, were signed before the rebels even took control of Tripoli. That is not revolution. That is procurement. The betrayal did not occur on a battlefield. It occurred in conference rooms, in Gulf embassies, in NATO command centers, in the corridors of the United Nations, and in the quiet, complicit silence of African capitals. Libya did not collapse because it was weak. It collapsed because too many powerful actors wanted it weakened. And when the interests of global powers, regional rivals, multinational corporations, and dependent African governments intersect, the result is not justice. The result is demolition disguised as liberation. This is the architecture of influence that destroyed Libya, web of power where each strand pulled the country closer to collapse. And once the web tightened, there was no escape. What happened in Libya did not stop at Libya's borders. It spilled, flooded, and detonated across the entire Sahel, reshaping the politics, the security landscape, and the collective psychology of West Africa. The fall of Gaddafi was not the end of a regime. It was the beginning of a regional earthquake whose aftershocks are still being felt today. Because when Libya collapsed, it did not fall quietly. It collapsed with its weapons, its fighters, its networks, and its strategic position at the northern gate of Africa. The first shockwave hit Mali. Thousands of Tuareg fighters who once served in Gaddafi's elite units returned south with heavy weapons, anti-aircraft systems, and battlefield training. What had been a manageable insurgency in northern Mali transformed overnight into a full-scale rebellion armed with the remnants of the Libyan arsenal. Jihadist groups that had long lingered in the shadows suddenly found an opportunity. Akim entrenched itself. Ansar Dine rose. The Sahel became a theater for militias that had never before possessed such firepower. France launched Operation Serval in 2013, then Operation Barkhane. But instead of stabilizing the region, the interventions often deepened fractures, armed new factions, and created a dependency cycle where foreign militaries became the default solution to African problems created by foreign decisions in the first place. Then came Burkina Faso. Then Niger. Then Chad. Borders that once seemed meaningful became porous lines as the insecurity spread. The same weapons, the same ideology, the same vacuum. Tripoli's fall had opened a corridor of chaos stretching more than 3,000 kilometers into the heart of the continent. And beneath that chaos, there was a clear pattern: every country destabilized after Libya was either resource-rich, strategically located, or politically aligned with Gaddafi's Pan-African vision. This was not coincidence. It was consequence. The second shockwave was economic. Libya had been a funder for the African Union, a financier of infrastructure, a stabilizing anchor. When Libya's wealth was seized, frozen, or looted, those funds vanished. African development banks lost billions. Projects collapsed. States that relied on Libyan investment turned to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, falling back into the debt cycles that Gaddafi had urged them to escape. And as the conditions worsened, migration surged. Hundreds of thousands of Africans moved north through a broken Libya, hoping to cross the Mediterranean. Many never made it. They drowned at sea or were captured and sold in open-air slave markets that operated under the watch of militias funded by the same external powers that had promised democracy. If you believe this pattern is too consistent to be accidental, tell me your thoughts in the comments. The third shockwave was political. Before 2011, coups in West Africa were occasional. After Libya, they became cyclical. Mali in 2012. Mali again in 2020. Again in 2021. Burkina Faso in 2022. Niger in 2023. Leaders overthrown. Militaries empowered. Populations radicalized not by extremism but by exhaustion. People had seen what Western-led stability looked like in Libya, and they wanted none of it. When foreign powers lectured them about democracy, they pointed to Tripoli and asked, "Is this your model?" And when new military leaders in the Sahel, Assimi Goïta in Mali, Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, Abdourahmane Tiani in Niger, declared that they would not allow their countries to become the next Libya, they were not speaking metaphorically. They were speaking historically. Meanwhile, Europe faced the consequences of its own decisions. The migrant crisis intensified. Terror attacks in European capitals increased. Gas flows were disrupted. Energy prices fluctuated. Everything that policymakers claimed they were trying to prevent in 2011 became the reality they had engineered. The Mediterranean turned into a humanitarian graveyard. Libya turned into a geopolitical playground for Russia, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and European states all competing for influence. And this is where the story expands even further. Because Libya was not simply destroyed. It was partitioned. France backed one faction. Italy backed another. The United Arab Emirates backed another. Turkey intervened militarily to prevent collapse. Russia embedded private military contractors. Egypt sought to secure its border. Algeria resisted any foreign military presence near its frontier. Morocco positioned itself diplomatically. Every nation that touched the Mediterranean or the Sahara saw Libya not as a tragedy but as an opportunity. And through this scramble, the Sahel itself began to transform. Countries that once aligned with Paris began to pivot eastward. Anti-French sentiment surged. Civil societies questioned decades of dependency. The emergence of the alliance of Sahel states, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, was not a sudden political accident. It was the direct response to a decade of instability that the fall of Gaddafi unleashed. Leaders like Traoré often speak of sovereignty not as ideology but as survival. They watched what happened when a wealthy African state trusted external partners. They saw how quickly protection turned into destruction. They understood that without regional unity, each country would be picked apart one by one. And what about the rest of the world? China expanded its economic footprint. Russia offered security partnerships. Turkey sought commercial influence. The United States doubled down on counterterrorism. The European Union poured money into border control. Yet none of these moves solved the root problem. The Sahel became unstable because Libya was dismantled. And Libya was dismantled because an independent Africa was unacceptable to the powers whose wealth depends on African weakness. Today, when Ibrahim Traoré is demonized in the same language once used against Gaddafi, the pattern is unmistakable. When Niger nationalizes its uranium, the backlash is predictable. When Mali expels foreign troops, the outrage is expected. The script does not change. Only the actors do. The truth is that the fall of Libya created a geopolitical vacuum so deep that no foreign intervention has been able to fill it. But the people of the Sahel are trying. They are building new alliances, rewriting their security doctrines, and confronting the legacy of a war that was sold as liberation but delivered collapse. The story that began in Tripoli continues today in Ouagadougou, Bamako, Niamey, and beyond. And until Libya finds peace, the region will continue to live with the consequences of a decision made not in Africa, but far above it. For a decade, the story of Libya was told as if it were a closed chapter. A tragedy, yes, but a tragedy frozen in time. But here is the twist that breaks the narrative: Libya did not die in 2011. Libya multiplied. Its downfall became the blueprint, the warning, and the spark for a generation that refuses to repeat the same mistake. The very act meant to silence Gaddafi ended up amplifying him far beyond anything he could have achieved while alive. That is the part no one expected. That is the part no one planned for. Because the truth is this: the fire that was supposed to consume Libya ignited the Sahel. Look at Mali. Look at Burkina Faso. Look at Niger. These countries did not simply break from old alliances, they broke from an entire mindset. They stopped believing that foreign intervention brings safety. They no longer trusted the promises of stability from powers who destroyed the most stable nation on the continent. When Gaddafi stood before the United Nations in 2009 and warned that small countries must not place their fate in the hands of great powers, the world dismissed him. Today, his warning forms the ideological foundation of the new politics rising in the Sahel. That is the twist: the man they tried to erase became the reference point for those who refused to be erased. The second twist is even deeper. The fight unfolding in the Sahel is not merely about territory, terrorism, or governance. It is a contest over narrative itself. For decades, foreign powers controlled the storylines of African conflicts, African leaders, African futures. They labeled who was a threat, who was a reformer, who was a dictator, who was a partner. But the people of the Sahel, after witnessing what those labels did to Libya, have begun to write their own definitions. Western narratives no longer hold the same authority. Media campaigns no longer dictate legitimacy. And every time a young African watches the footage of Gaddafi's last moments, they do not see a tyrant. They see the cost of believing the wrong storytellers. The third twist is geopolitical. In trying to crush an African-led vision of independence, the intervention in Libya unintentionally accelerated the realignment of the entire region. France's influence collapsed faster in the 2020s than in the previous 30 years combined. Military partnerships shifted. Political alliances fractured. New players entered the field. The Sahel stopped being a silent buffer zone and became the epicenter of a sovereignty movement that Paris, Washington, London, and Brussels could no longer predict or control. Gaddafi did not live to see it, but his dream of an Africa that stands on its own feet no longer sounds unrealistic. In Bamako, it is policy. In Ouagadougou, it is ideology. In Niamey, it is strategy. And that leads to the final twist: the story of Libya was not the story of a regime falling. It was the story of a mask falling. The mask of humanitarian intervention. The mask of foreign protection. The mask of, we know what is best for Africa. Once the mask fell, millions saw the machinery behind it. They saw who truly benefits when African nations fracture. They saw how quickly the world calls for peace while preparing for extraction. And once a people see the machinery, they do not unsee it. That is the twist the world did not anticipate. They wanted the downfall of one man. What they created instead was the awakening of a continent. The story of Libya is not just the story of a nation torn apart. It is the story of a continent learning, painfully and publicly, what happens when it trusts the wrong hands with its future. What was done to Libya was meant to frighten Africa into silence. Instead, it forced Africa to confront a truth it had been avoiding, that no one will protect African sovereignty except Africans themselves. The Sahel understands this now. They saw the cost of believing in foreign rescuers. They saw how quickly protection became predation. And they chose a different path. But the question remains, will the rest of Africa choose it too? Because the next chapter will not be written in Tripoli or Paris or Washington. It will be written in the decisions made by ordinary Africans, in the courage of leaders who refuse to kneel, and in whether the continent finally stands together where Libya once stood alone. If you do not want this truth buried again, if you believe Africa deserves the right to write its own story, then like, comment, and subscribe. Not for me. For every voice that was never allowed to speak.